Robert Sterling was 43, a seasoned teacher at Middleton High, with more than a decade of experience under his belt. His students respected him, but it was a respect tinged with fear. He had a way about him, strict, demanding, and, to some, a little too personal. He made his students earn their grades, or so he said. But over the years, rumors had started to circulate, especially among the girls in his classes. They spoke in hushed tones about how Sterling would linger too long near their desks, offer unsolicited help during exams, and how his compliments carried an undertone that felt wrong. No one ever spoke up officially, though. Sterling was careful, too careful. Lily Hartman was one of his students. At 17, she was quiet, sharp, and observant. She kept her head down, rarely getting involved in the drama that swirled around the school. But Lily wasn't oblivious. She'd seen how Sterling operated, especially around girls like her. Studious, quiet, vulnerable. She'd heard the stories, the whispers in the hallways, but had always brushed them off. Until now. It was the day of the final exam, a particularly hot and stifling afternoon in June. The air in the classroom was heavy, making it hard to concentrate. Students hunched over their desks, scratching their pens furiously across the paper, their nerves frayed as they worked through the essay Sterling had assigned. It was a difficult one, requiring not just knowledge but insight. Lily was focused, determined to ace it. About halfway through the exam, she sensed him. She didn't need to look up to know that Sterling was hovering near her desk. His presence was unmistakable, the way he liked to loom over students as they worked, exerting silent pressure. Lily, Sterling's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he leaned closer to her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. She stiffened but kept her eyes on her paper. His warm breath brushed her neck, and she swallowed hard, gripping her pen tightly. "I think you're being a little stubborn," he continued, his tone almost condescending. "This exam is important. Don't you want to pass?" His voice was smooth, like honey, but it dripped with something else, something sinister. Lily clenched her jaw. She didn't respond right away, her pulse quickening. She knew what he was doing, and she wasn't going to fall for it. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, though she felt anything but. She could feel his eyes on her, lingering, waiting for her to change her mind, to give in. Sterling didn't move for a moment. He just stood there, his hands still resting on her chair, his presence suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he straightened up. "Suit yourself," he muttered, and walked away, continuing his slow patrol around the room. The rest of the exam passed in tense silence. Lily kept her head down, fighting the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She finished the essay, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her confidence. She knew her work was good, maybe not perfect, but certainly enough to pass. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sterling had something else in mind. The bell rang, signaling the end of the exam. Students quickly gathered their things, anxious to escape the oppressive heat of the classroom. Lily packed up slowly, casting a glance at Sterling as he collected the exam papers. He met her eyes briefly, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his lips. It made her skin crawl. The next day, Sterling announced the exam results. The class was buzzing with nervous energy as they awaited their grades. One by one, he called out names, handing back the papers with a brief comment for each student. "Well done," he said to one. "Not bad," to another. It went on like that until he reached Lily. She sat up straight, her heart thudding in her chest. But when Sterling looked at her, his expression was unreadable. "Lily Hartman," he called out, holding up her paper. She stood and walked to the front of the room, the knot in her stomach tightening with each step. When she reached his desk, Sterling handed her the paper without a word. She glanced down at it, her breath catching in her throat. F, a bright, red letter at the top of her paper. Her eyes widened. She stared at it, unable to comprehend. She'd never failed a test in her life, and she knew. Her essay had been far better than that. She looked up at Sterling, but his face was calm, almost amused. "You'll have to do better next time," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Lily's hands shook as she returned to her seat. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, the whispers starting to ripple through the room. They all knew. Sterling had failed her on purpose. Later, after class, Lily sought out some of her friends, the ones who had also taken the exam. They sat at the far end of the cafeteria, comparing notes and results. "You won't believe it," Lily muttered, sitting down with a heavy sigh. "He failed me." "What?" One of her friends, Sophie, gasped. "You? No way. You're like the best in class." "I know," Lily said, her voice rising in frustration. "I don't understand. My essay wasn't perfect, but it wasn't an F. He's screwing with me. On purpose." The group exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew about Sterling's reputation, though none of them had ever been able to prove anything. The school administration didn't seem interested in investigating rumors without solid evidence. And Sterling was good at covering his tracks. "What are you going to do?" asked Sarah, one of the quieter girls in the group. "I don't know," Lily muttered, running a hand through her hair. "I have to retake the exam. He's giving me another chance tomorrow." The table fell silent. They all knew what that meant. Sterling never offered retakes unless there was something in it for him. He had her cornered, just like he had done to others before her. But Lily wasn't going to let him get away with it. She clenched her fists under the table, her jaw set. Tomorrow, she would confront him. One way or another, she wasn't going to let Robert Sterling ruin her future. The tension was palpable as Lily left the cafeteria that day, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew what she was up against, and part of her was scared. Scared of what Sterling might try. But she had to go through with it. She had to face him. Tomorrow would be different. The next morning, Lily Hartman stood outside Robert Sterling's classroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of how the retake would go. She knew she wasn't just walking into a simple exam. This was a trap, and Sterling was waiting for her to fall into it. She clenched her fists, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. The classroom was empty, just as Sterling had promised. It was before school hours, and no one else would be around. Just him. And her. Sterling was already seated at his desk, casually flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up as she entered, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ah, Lily," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Right on time. I like that." Lily didn't respond. She walked to the front row and set her bag down, her eyes fixed on him. She could feel the tension in the room, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Sterling stood up and walked toward her, slowly, deliberately. "So, are you ready for your retake? I hope you've had time to reflect on where you went wrong." He stopped in front of her desk, leaning on it slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "I didn't go wrong," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling up inside her. "You failed me on purpose." Sterling raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Did I? That's a pretty serious accusation. Maybe your essay just wasn't up to par. Maybe you need a little extra help." He leaned in closer, his hand resting on the edge of her desk. Lily's stomach churned. She had heard those words before, from the other girls who'd experienced his extra help, but she wasn't going to let him manipulate her. Not this time. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice firm. "I just want to retake the exam and leave." Sterling's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You see, Lily, the problem is, I don't think you're taking this seriously. You're a bright girl, but you've got a lot to learn about how things work in the real world." He stepped around her desk, positioning himself behind her chair. She could feel his presence looming over her, and every muscle in her body tensed. He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. "If you want to pass, you're going to have to do more than just write an essay. You understand that, don't you?" Lily's heart raced. Her fingers curled into fists under the desk as she stared straight ahead. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it. Sterling standing so close, his voice thick with implied threat, made her blood run cold. For a moment, she didn't move. She couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of that room. But something inside her refused to let him win. Not like this. She wasn't going to be another victim. She stood up suddenly, knocking her chair back. Sterling stepped back, surprised by her sudden movement. "You don't scare me," Lily said. her voice shaking with both fear and determination. "I'm not going to play your game." Sterling's eyes darkened. His friendly, condescending tone dropped. "Sit down," he said coldly. Lily didn't move. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. She could leave, but that wouldn't solve anything. If she walked out now, he'd win. He'd keep his power over her and the others. "No, this had to end now." "I said, sit down," Sterling repeated, his voice growing more threatening. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for her shoulder. That was it. The final straw. Before she even realized what she was doing, Lily's hand shot toward her back. She grabbed the heavy glass water bottle, the one her father had given her, the one she always carried. Without thinking, she swung it up with all her strength. The bottle connected with Sterling's head with a sickening crack. His eyes widened in shock as he stumbled backward, clutching his temple. Blood seeped through his fingers, dripping down the side of his face. "You little," he started, but his voice was weak, disoriented. He staggered, trying to regain his balance, but the force of the blow had left him reeling. Lily stood frozen, her chest heaving as she gripped the shattered remains of the bottle. Her mind was a blur of fear, adrenaline, and disbelief at what she had just done. Sterling groaned, stumbling into the desk behind him. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused as blood continued to trickle down his face. For a moment, the room was deathly quiet. Then Sterling collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling like a rag doll. His head hit the ground with a dull thud, and he lay still. Lily stood there, staring at him, her hands trembling. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of what she had done was beginning to crash down on her. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Someone had heard the commotion. The door flew open, and in rushed another teacher, followed by a security guard. They stopped short, taking in the scene. Sterling lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head, and Lily standing over him, the broken bottle still in her hand. The security guard rushed to Sterling's side, checking for a pulse. His face turned grim as he radioed for help. The teacher pulled Lily aside, her voice sharp with panic. "What happened? What did you do?" Lily didn't answer. She couldn't. The reality of the situation was still sinking in. The room was spinning, and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. It wasn't long before the paramedics arrived, followed closely by the police. Sterling was loaded onto a stretcher, his face pale, his breathing shallow. They wheeled him out of the room, and Lily watched them go, her hands still shaking. An officer approached her, his face hard but not unkind. "You need to come with us," he said, his voice firm. Lily didn't resist. She dropped the remains of the bottle and let them lead her out of the room. Her mind was numb, still trying to process everything that had just happened. As they walked down the hall, the officer glanced at her, his voice low. "Why did you do it?" Lily looked at him, her eyes distant, hollow. "Because no one else would." The ride to the police station was silent. Lily sat in the back of the patrol car, her hands still shaking, her mind racing. The gravity of what she had done was starting to sink in. She had attacked Robert Sterling. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She hadn't meant to hurt him that badly, but he had left her no choice. He had pushed her, just like he had pushed so many others. The patrol car pulled up to the station, and an officer opened the door for her. She stepped out slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her. Inside, they led her to a small, cold interrogation room. The walls were bare, the single light overhead casting harsh shadows on the plain metal table in the center of the room. They told her to wait, and then they left her alone with her thoughts. She had no idea how long she sat there. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time felt distorted, slipping through her fingers as she tried to replay the events of that morning in her mind. Over and over again, she saw Sterling's face, his smug smile, his predatory gaze. She saw his hand reaching for her shoulder, felt the weight of the glass bottle in her hand, and heard the sickening crack when it collided with his head. The door creaked open, pulling Lily from her thoughts. A woman entered, dressed in a navy suit, her expression serious but not unfriendly. She set a folder down on the table and took a seat across from Lily. "I'm Detective Harper," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'm here to ask you a few questions about what happened this morning." Lily nodded, her throat dry. She hadn't spoken since she left the school. Detective Harper opened the folder, glanced at the contents, then looked up at Lily. "Do you understand why you're here?" Lily swallowed hard and nodded again. I hit him. I hit Mr. Sterling." The detective's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained professional. "Can you tell me why?" Lily's hands twisted in her lap as she searched for the words. He was going to, her voice caught, and she took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "He's been doing things. To the girls. In class. For years. He failed me on purpose because I wouldn't play his game. He kept saying I needed his help, but I didn't. I just wanted to retake the exam." Detective Harper watched her closely, her pen poised over a notepad. "When you say he's been doing things, can you be more specific?" Lily hesitated, feeling the weight of the words she was about to speak. He'd get too close. To the girls. He'd offer to help, but it wasn't really help. He'd make us feel like we needed him, like we had to give him something in return." The detective's expression hardened. "Are you saying that Robert Sterling was sexually harassing students?" Lily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes. Everyone knew it, but no one could prove it. He was careful. But today, when I went to retake the exam, he started getting close again. Too close. And I couldn't let him. I couldn't let him do it again." Detective Harper scribbled a few notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Did you report any of this to the school administration? Did any of the other girls?" "We tried," Lily said, her voice shaking. "But there was never any proof. He was too careful. The administration didn't want to hear rumors. They wanted evidence." Harper sighed, clearly frustrated by the familiar pattern. "And today, when you hit him with the bottle, were you defending yourself? Did you feel like you were in immediate danger?" Lily looked down at her hands, her fingers still trembling. "I don't know. I couldn't let him touch me. I knew what was going to happen if I let it go on." The detective was quiet for a moment, processing everything Lily had said. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying the girl sitting in front of her. "Sterling is in the hospital," she said gently. "He's unconscious, but stable. The doctors say he'll recover, but it's going to take time. Do you understand what that means?" Lily nodded slowly. She understood. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. Detective Harper closed the folder in front of her and stood up. "I'm going to need to speak with the other students and staff at the school. We'll get to the bottom of this, but for now, you're going to have to stay here." Lily felt a lump rise in her throat, but she forced herself to nod. She wasn't sure what staying here meant. Would she be arrested? Charged with assault? She wasn't sure what was going to happen next. The door opened, and an officer led Lily out of the interrogation room and into a small holding cell. The metal bars clanged shut behind her, and for the first time since it all happened, she felt the full weight of the situation crash down on her. She sat down on the narrow bench, burying her face in her hands as tears began to fall. She had stood up to Sterling, but at what cost? Lily didn't know how much time had passed since she'd been placed in the holding cell. Her thoughts swirled, bouncing between fear, guilt, and a sliver of relief that Sterling hadn't been able to touch her. She defended herself, but now she faced consequences that seemed too big to comprehend. It was late afternoon when Detective Harper returned. She unlocked the cell and gestured for Lily to follow her. "I've spoken to several of your classmates," Harper said as they walked down the sterile hallway. "It seems your story lines up with what many of the girls have been saying for years. You weren't the first to have a problem with Mr. Sterling." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she should feel hopeful or more afraid. What happens now? The detective stopped at the end of the hall, her eyes meeting Lily's with a grim but sympathetic look. "We're investigating Sterling's behavior at the school. We've already found several other students willing to talk now that you've come forward. But this doesn't change the fact that you assaulted him, Lily. The legal process will take its course." Lily nodded, her stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and anger. She had done what she had to do, but that didn't mean it was over. As the days passed, the story of Robert Sterling's behavior spread like wildfire. Other students began coming forward with their own experiences, stories of unwanted attention, inappropriate comments, and the same pressure to submit to his manipulations. The administration, which had once dismissed the rumors, was now scrambling to save face. Investigators dug into Sterling's past, uncovering a history of complaints that had been quietly brushed under the rug. Lily sat in her cell, day after day, awaiting her hearing. The world outside was changing because of what she had done, but it was little comfort. She still had to face the consequences of her actions. When her court date finally arrived, the courtroom was packed with people, students, parents, teachers, and reporters, all eager to see the outcome of the case. Lily sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap as her lawyer made the case for self-defense. The prosecution, however, argued that her actions had been excessive, that hitting Sterling with a glass bottle had crossed the line. As the trial wore on, something unexpected happened. Sterling's reputation continued to crumble under the weight of the testimonies against him. It became clear that Lily wasn't the only victim, and the narrative shifted. She wasn't just a girl who had lashed out in violence. She was someone who had stood up against a predator when no one else would. In the end, the judge ruled that while Lily's actions had been extreme, they were understandable given the circumstances. She was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling, but she was spared any jail time. Outside the courthouse, Lily stood surrounded by her family and friends, the weight of the trial finally lifting from her shoulders. The crowd that had gathered offered her words of support, and some of the girls from Sterling's class approached her with quiet thanks. Lily looked at them, her heart still heavy with everything that had happened. She hadn't set out to be a hero or a symbol of resistance. She had just wanted to stop the nightmare. But in doing so, she had become the one to expose the truth. And that, she realized, was worth everything she had been through.